This is Dan Schneider. This is another episode of American TV with Mitchell Hadley. This time we're back to doing a decade. We're doing the 1980s. So, Mitch, if you could just give a little background about who you are for those who've never seen one of these shows.
Hi, my name is Mitchell Hadley, and if you haven't seen us before, why haven't you? Anyway, I'm a classic television historian. I've been writing about it for 15 years at the website itsabouttv.com. My book, The Electronic Mirror, is a series of essays on classic TV and American culture. And I am putting the finishing touches on my next book, The Descent into Hell, which is a look at how mid-century television prophesized the world of today.
So, if we go back, it's been a few months since we did the 1970s. I've always maintained that sort of the mid-60s through the late 70s was the real golden age of television rather than the current cable age or the early 1950s with live television shows. But as we moved into the 1980s, it seemed that the big three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, started this slow and eventual bleeding of viewership in the early 80s or so. And a lot of people will attribute that to the 1984 Cable TV Act. Maybe can you give a little background about what that was and how that fundamentally changed the landscape of American television, not only cable but networks?
Sure, I would agree, first of all, that that there is the influence of cable played a big role in changing the landscape of television. In a way, it continues to today, even though cable TV isn't that big. But essentially what the Cable Communications Act of 1984 did was it instituted deregulation in the cable TV industry, and it promoted competition, especially in local areas. Why was this important? Well, because where I lived for the bulk of the 80s, Minneapolis, St. Paul, one of the top 20 television markets in the United States, and yet until the mid to late 80s, there was no cable television in the Twin Cities. It was a political football. Cable contracts often were given out as a sort of political patronage. There was a lot involved in getting cable into any given market. And until that penetration could happen, you weren't really able to enjoy the benefits of cable television as a viewer. You were hearing about it all the time, but you weren't actually experiencing it. However, once you got the Cable Act passed and that you were able to have local stations included in cable television, that penetration became more widespread. You saw the benefits almost immediately in that people received widespread exposure to what I would call the big three cable networks of the 80s: CNN, ESPN, and MTV. Each one of them was offering something that was not available on the commercial networks. It often offered something that was different, a different outlook, a different viewpoint, a different angle as to how you were going to be looking at things. And I think one of the prime examples of that is the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. This was in the early days of cable television, so a lot of people didn't experience it on cable. But one of the things that Ted Turner, the mogul who was in charge of CNN, one of the things he pointed out was that the assassination attempt against Reagan occurred after he had given a speech in a hotel in Washington, D.C. And he said that if you were watching the networks, you saw the bulletins with coverage of the shooting. If you were watching CNN, you saw the speech itself. So that was a major difference as to how news was being covered. You, rather than just having the bulletins, you were seeing the entire thing. And I think that goes with the other two as well, with MTV and ESPN, and we'll get into that. But what this really did was offer not just an alternative form of television for viewers, but it offered an expanded view of what was already in existence. And after that, you could argue that viewers would say of the networks, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough choice, it wasn't enough coverage, and it wasn't thorough enough when it was duplicate coverage.
So what ended up happening is this gave rise to sort of a whole flora and fauna of different types of television. I mean, you not only went from all sports or all news or all music television, you had things that were interesting, educational, like history television before they did Ancient Aliens and all that. You had things like C-SPAN for policy wonks. You could, know some obscure bill about whether we funded a bridge in Lower Ohio or something. And it also seems to me that this act opened up the route for 24/7 television. A lot of people under the age of 40 may not even know, but the first 35 plus years of television in America, things signed off at about 1 p.m. in major markets, and in lesser markets probably, at 10 or 11 p.m. During that day. There also seemed to have become, you also had then by that time even a 35-year backlog of television repeats that you could run and get, like the game show networks, something we've talked of before, and so forth. And yet there was this constant fracturing into sort of micro markets and micro audiences. Maybe talk a little bit about that, how the if you want to call it pandering to the most micro niche audiences, what effect it had on television and the larger American culture abroad.
Well, I think you hit it on the head there with the use of the term niche, that you had these boutique cable networks that came up in the immediate aftermath of the act. Not only networks like C-SPAN and the History Channel, but you had HGTV for people who were into gardening and home improvement. You had ESPN Classic for people who wanted to watch old sporting events, not current ones. You had the Biography Channel, which was a spin-off of a niche network to begin with, A&E, which focused on, as its title would suggest, arts and entertainment. You had, at one point, for a brief moment in the overall history of television, you had this wonderful possibility that cable was going to fulfill what the television pioneers had hoped for from the very beginning, which was a way of programming so that everyone's interests could be met. If you wanted to see ballet and opera, you had the arts channels. If you wanted to see sports, you had the sports channels. You had the news channels. You had the public affairs channels. You had channels dedicated solely to movies. You had all these various aspects that were coming into play. And you're right, you had a tremendous backlog of programming that could be used to fill out all of this. You look at TV Land, which started out as Nick at Night, when Nickelodeon, which was a network that was primarily designed for kids, school age and even preschool age kids, but mostly for teens. You had Nickelodeon, which would be on television during the day. Then at night, when that audience was no longer the focus of their programming, they would morph into something called Nick at Night, which presented shows that hadn't been seen for a long time on a national basis. You had Leave It to Beaver, you had Dobie Gillis, you had Route 66, Burke's Law, 77 Sunset Strip, a huge inventory of what we would call classic television programming that had been seen in syndication off and on, but hadn't really had the national penetration that programs like The Twilight Zone and Perry Mason and Alfred Hitchcock enjoyed. So this was a great boon for people who enjoyed that kind of programming, and eventually it became its own network, TV Land. And then you had offshoots of TV Land. You had something like MeTV, which was the over-the-air equivalent of Nick at Night, also serving the same audience, but in a non-cable basis. So at first, this seemed like a great thing. You had the ability of people to be able to see the niche program that they wanted to without necessarily being stuck with programs that they didn't want. Now, I think as we go further into the history of television, we find that this turned out not to be the panacea that people had hoped for, because the niche networks get swallowed up, I think partly because of the availability of classic shows being released on DVD, and partly because as the inventory was churned, you started to exhaust what was available, and therefore they had to start pandering, and I'm using that word intentionally, they had to start pandering to a different demographic and to a different audience, which results in things like Ice Cold Truckers and A&E becoming almost entirely reality programming, and HG becoming almost entirely a slash between reality programming and buying and selling houses. Virtually no gardening, virtually no kinds of home improvement type shows. Those go off into their own niche, and that becomes mostly over-the-air television. But it was great potential at the time, but I think it did dramatically change what we saw on television. But in the end, as it has been with so many cases that we've talked about, it winds up being unfulfilled potential.
So, Mitch, you'd mentioned all the fracturing of these micro niche networks. I don't think you mentioned, though, that we got the rise of shopping networks too in the 80s and 90s, where you could buy camping equipment, or you could buy faux jewelry, or you could buy bubble bath, or you could buy whatever. And it seems to me that this fracturing on television in the early to mid 80s was a precursor of what would become the internet. These shopping networks were Amazon before Amazon. To what degree do you think that today's internet, with the Amazons and the streaming networks, are they outgrowths of this period of the 1980s?
Yes, I think they definitely are, as far as the shopping networks are concerned, because you'll remember that when Amazon first became big, what it did is it sold books and shipped books, DVDs and CDs, but primarily books. Amazon at that point was not a one-stop shopping location, but I think that in response to things like Home Shopping Network or QVC, you saw companies like Amazon broadening their approach and trying to become a place where you could do all of your shopping. Now, between the shopping networks and things like Amazon, I think it's been terrible for America in general because it's taken away the brick and mortar experience and it has made us less social in that way because it's eliminated one gathering spot that we had in common that we could where we could go shopping, we could run into people, we could just be out, we could find out things that we didn't even know we were interested in, which is
Yeah.
one of the great things about going to a bookstore.
Yeah.
Now the same thing happens with TV in its broader sense. As you fragment the audience, you wind up not having to provide programming that can have an appeal to everyone in the household. Ed Sullivan is probably the perfect example of that, particularly when Sullivan started to introduce the rock performers into his show near the end. But Sullivan was always known as something, the kind of a show that had something for everybody. Mom and Dad could watch something. Younger kids could watch Topo Gigio. Older kids would be watching the Stones. It had some kind of an appeal like that that kept us together. And now that you've got the niche stations proliferating, you don't have that. You have people able to find their own forms of entertainment. We didn't recognize it at the beginning of the cable era so much, but as cable became bigger and bigger, and as people became dissatisfied with the cost and the choice of cable and expressed their desires for something called a la carte programming, which cable still has not arrived at, you found people looking for alternatives. That eventually became streaming, that eventually became on-demand programming. But what it was an indication that people wanted some kind of programming that appealed to them in a very narrow, very strict sense, without regard to other kinds of programs. And as you got into the situation where you had to pay for everything, regardless of whether or not you watched it, you saw more of a demand for the kind of streaming solutions where you could get only what you wanted, only when you wanted it. And that, again, eliminates a common sharing that we have. I talk about this at length in the things that I've written in my books and online, but this idea of a shared experience where everybody saw the same thing at the same time, and it became, at worst, water cooler conversation, at best, water cooler conversation, at worst, a shared experience of something that was either tremendous or horrifying. That has departed so much now. One of the great cultural touchstones of the 80s is the Who Shot JR episode of Dallas. You couldn't have that today in the same way because either an entire series is dumped uploaded, dumped on people all at the same time, or people aren't going to experience the show at the same time. They're going to watch it when they have time. But what that has eliminated is that shared experience that tended to unify us as a culture. We were just beginning to see that in the 80s. Now, of course, it's all over the place. And yes, I think you're absolutely right that this is all an outgrowth, all morphing from what we began to see in the 80s. It's a very interesting decade because, as you suggested with our talk about the 60s into the 70s being another golden age, I don't necessarily associate the 80s with great creativity when it comes to individual shows. We'll probably touch on those through this broadcast, but there were some very fine programs. But if you're looking for creativity, I don't necessarily see it in the programming itself. What I do see as far as creativity is what television is about to become. What it's starting to evolve into is far greater than what it actually is showing on TV.
So let's talk about HBO and the movie type networks that came after it. It seemed to me that for the first 35 or so years of television in America, there was a distinct difference between television and film. There was a sort of de facto segregation. You were a TV actor or a film actor. Film actors didn't want to do TV. But by the early 80s, HBO comes along. They've got big budgeted stuff. They're doing movies. The 1980s is also an era that we can talk a little bit about, the telefilms of the era, as well as the miniseries. But it seems to me there's a difference that we're looking towards coming together, the movies coming together with television, and then later movies and television together coming together with internet and streaming. What historic value does HBO have here? Because it seems to me that that's a very key player in this turn away from the sort of idea that television is something of itself to being a broader part of mass media.
Well, HBO is a big player in this for several reasons. One of them is that it is bringing movies and other programs, other formerly commercial programs, to the public uncut and uninterrupted. And they're doing it with many movies that are, let's call it, recent, as opposed to movies that are decades old. This is a great shift in programming. In the 60s, even into the 70s, you still had major motion pictures that weren't making their debuts on TV until 6, 7, 8 years after they had been in the theaters. Or in the case of a movie like Gone with the Wind, it had been decades before it actually premiered on TV. Now that turnaround time is much less. So that's making a difference in the way people are viewing, consuming movies, but also in the demands that they have for their television programming. The other way that it makes a big difference is that you see HBO starting to produce its own original programming. It's not only movies by the end of the decade, but you see HBO get into sports, particularly boxing, where it becomes the replacement, if you will, for the closed circuit broadcasts that many people had become accustomed to, where you had to go into a movie theater to watch a major championship fight. Now you could watch it at home. You might pay a little extra for it, but the point was that it had transferred from being a theater experience to a home experience. You had programs that, like The Hitchhiker, and Tales from the Dark Side, that were being produced specifically for cable television. And as that started to increase, you saw a greater acceptance of formerly big screen movie stars who were willing to appear on television in more what will come to be called prestige TV, where cable is able to offer an experience that is different from the movie theater. How is it different? Well, you're able to go more in depth into something than you would if you were seeing it just in the movie theaters. Something like Dune, for example, which was a disaster when David Lynch worked on it. But as you get into Dune as a multi-part movie experience, it becomes completely different. Well, the same thing happens if you take the movie experience and transform it to television instead. When you mentioned the miniseries, which is a huge part of the 80s, ask yourself what it would be like to try to make a movie version of Shogun, a 2.5, 3-hour epic. David Lean made his career out of some of these magnificent epics, Lawrence of Arabia, for example. But now imagine that you had 10, 12, 14 hours that you could dedicate to an adaptation of a book, and you could do it with a good sized budget. You could do it in such a way that it would guarantee a sizable audience, and you could do it in a way that it wasn't going to come across as a cheap production, and not just in terms of the budget, but in terms of the writing, in terms of the acting, in terms of location shots. That redefines what that experience is going to be on television in the same way that made-for-TV movies, especially the ABC movies in the late 60s and 70s, started to redefine what the made-for-TV movie was. And in both cases, you start to have a crossover where you have actors and actresses primarily known for appearing on the big screen who are now willing to do things on the small screen because they know that it is going to be something that is going to enhance their career. It's not going to make it look like they were slumming. It's not going to make it look as if they are going to TV after the end of their careers, which is what so often had been the case, where formerly big name stars went to TV after their cachet, so to speak, had ended in the movies. So again, it's opening up something completely new and different from what people had been used to. And I think you're absolutely right. HBO is kind of in front on that, and it totally changes the way television will be seen by stars going forward and to this day.
But it does seem to me that HBO basically ended up killing off the television movie
Yeah,
that
it
as
did.
it was, because it seemed to me by the late 70s to early 80s we were dealing with television, made for television movies on the network that were things like Dawn, Portrait of a Teenage Runaway, The Burning Bed. So there was about an 8 to 10 year window of the late 70s to early 80s where they weren't necessarily prestige in the sense that they had the glamour of film, but they were dealing with topics. I think Carol Burnett had a famous one about her son being killed.
Friendly fire,
Right,
yes.
right. So there were these topical issues. HBO comes along, and they seem to take all of that, and what you're left with is 3 or 4 TV films a year from Valerie Bertinelli or Jacqueline Smith, and they're usually lighthearted romances. It seems to me that by the late 80s to the early 90s, when TV movies seemed to go off the air, they just became pieces of fluff again.
Yeah, you're right. I think that part of the way HBO was able to gut the movie experience on television is by being able to present movies uncut and uninterrupted. Why do you want to watch a movie like, no, Ben-Hur? Why would you want to watch it over 2 nights with commercials and possibly cut for television when you could see it all in one night without commercials in its entirety on HBO? So that's one way in which networks like HBO change that movie experience. The other way, as you pointed out, is that they're able to get into some very tough issues. You mentioned the movies that were on TV, Burning Bed, That Certain Summer, which dealt with homosexuality, others movies that deal with some really current topics. And television did a very good job doing that. But I think that there are people who would argue that commercial television was not able to deal with them in their rawest sense. Now, you can say that cable exploited that. I mean, you can add the titillation factor, you can add nudity and more explicit sex, but you've also got just the very fact that there are some things that are not going to pass the censor's shears on commercial television that will on cable television, because cable television isn't regulated by the same rules. The FCC has no say over what cable television can and can't show. Therefore, cable can go places where commercial TV can't. And so, in that sense, you're giving people an elevated experience. You're giving them something that they can't get on commercial TV. And as so often is the case, you start to look at it and you say, well, which one of these? You know, if I can pay money for HBO, I can pay money for cable. And yes, I'm used to having TV free. But now when I pay for it up front, I don't get the commercials, I don't get the interruptions, I don't get the editing, and I get something that's original, something that's hard hitting, something that can deal with an adult topic in an adult way. Plus, I get a half a dozen movies a month that I'm interested in seeing that add to that experience overall. So if it's presented to you in that way, well, you know what are you going to do? I think for a lot of people, the choice became to sign up for HBO or Showtime or the movie channel, these different the Disney Channel, these different cable outlets that you wound up paying extra for, but they were giving you the experience you couldn't get on commercial TV.
Syndicated television also seems to fundamentally change in the 1980s. We mentioned a show or two ago how British television from ITV and BBC had been syndicated in the U.S. And previously in the sort of the 1970s, there was very, very little that was just syndicated shows. Like, I mean, Mr. Ed, I believe, was syndicated. The Superman with George Reeves in the 50s. But what the syndicated shows of the 70s were basically mostly reruns.
Yes.
The Twilight Zones, The Odd Couple, Mary Tyler Moore, and Leave It to Beaver kind of things. The Brady Bunch became a mega phenomenon because of being syndicated. But first run syndication seems to have taken root, and I think it was the mid to late 80s that we saw the rise of, well, syndicated television saw the rise of the franchise, reviving old franchises. There was a
Yes.
Twilight Zone that I think was first on CBS, but then they did it on syndication.
Correct.
Star Trek, The Next Generation was on syndication. The War of the Worlds, which from a 1950s adaptation of the H.G. Wells movies came. And then there was also, it seemed like most of the rest of the syndicated television shows were stuff that didn't make the networks. There was crap like Harry and the Hendersons about a Bigfoot. There was Small Wonder about a little robot girl. And these all seem to be lesser iterations of bad shows on network television. So you either had shows that were trying to build an audience like the Star Trek franchise or Twilight Zone, or you had shows that probably should never have made it past the pilot.
Yeah, and one other thing that I would throw in there that you didn't mention was sports, which was carrying the syndication market in many ways through the 70s and into the early 80s. As an example, in 1982, there were maybe a dozen college football bowl games. That was it. You have over 40 today, but back then you had maybe 12. And out of those 12, 4 or 5, 6 at the most were shown on network television. The rest of them were shown in syndication, either through Hughes Sports Network or TVS, which stood for Television Sports, or later on through Metro TV, which was another syndication market. That disappeared when ESPN came along. ESPN started first to simulcast some of the syndicated games that were being shown on a network called Mizlu, and later on they started to take over the broadcasting themselves. So all of these syndicated sports networks that were often ad hoc networks disappeared. From there on, of course, we've gotten to the point where ESPN has not only televised bowl games, they create them. They own them. They exist not to reward performance on the field, but to provide a relatively inexpensive form of programming that's going to bring the network better ratings than what they would have if they were showing some kind of a debate show. So we see in ESPN, we see an example of creating programming that is very similar to what you're talking about with some of this first run syndication. But I think you are right, though, that the first run syndication, we saw at the end of the rural purge era when you had Lawrence Welk and Hee Haw being two shows that went into first run syndication and became extremely successful. You have other shows, many of the ones that you mentioned now, that have a brief network run, or maybe not so brief, maybe 2-3 seasons. They build up an audience that is fairly loyal, but also fairly small on a network basis. They go into syndication, a show like Too Close for Comfort, for instance, that becomes very successful in a syndicated format, whereas it picks up an entirely new life that it didn't have when it was on network television. And so you see that kind of growth in the syndicated market. And the flip side of that being what you talked about, that you see some shows that just aren't good, but they are made to fit a certain need that local stations have. Now that need began when the local access law was passed in Congress. And, one of the things you find out about television is that Congress has gotten involved in it a lot. And many times, if not most times, what happens is that the unintended consequence of that government intervention overwhelms what the original intent was. In the case of the local access, it was meant to produce shows that addressed local issues and public affairs. In the reality, what happened was that it was filled up with syndication and reruns. And you have an awful show like Police Surgeon from the 1970s, which was a Canadian import, that is one of the worst shows that is on television. You see this carrying over in the 80s. You have game shows filling that time slot. You have strip runs of shows that are also running at the same time on network television, but you may have them under a different name. So Marcus Welby becomes Robert Young, Family Doctor. The Rockford Files becomes Jim Rockford, Private Investigator. You have things like that. And then you have, as you pointed out, first run shows that are being made specifically for the syndication market and are either great successes like Star Trek, The Next Generation, which totally reinfuses the Star Trek franchise, or something like War of the Worlds. You have horror shows and science fiction shows carving out a niche in syndication that you wouldn't have been able to address because science fiction is still not a friendly genre on network television. But then you also have shows that just appeal to the lowest common denominator, and they're there to fill a time slot and to sell some airtime. And it really, again, is a betrayal of what could be great potential to have shows running in syndication, in first run syndication, like mobile showcase theater. That's on my mind because I've written about it fairly recently myself. But mobile showcase theater was kind of a version of television. It was a version of Masterpiece Theater, but it was going out on commercial stations in syndication with commercial interruptions, but it was taking programming that would ordinarily be on PBS and it was putting it on networks, and that was very successful, and that was what you would hope to see from syndicated broadcasting. Unfortunately, other than that, and something called Operation Prime Time, which we might talk about someday because it's kind of interesting. Operation Prime Time was pretty successful at doing that, and it survives with Entertainment Tonight, which is the last one that they put out. But too much of it turned out not being good. Whether it's Harry and the Hendersons or TMZ or other things like that that evolved through time. Again, I will say that this is an example of something that begins in the 80s that we see continuing in some respects to today. So again, it tends to reinforce what we've talked about, that the great thing about the 80s is not necessarily what was on, but what was made possible.
And it also seems to me that syndicated television might be the biggest overall winner, even more so than cable television, because it
Hmm.
seems that most of cable television has now adopted the syndicated model of the 80s. And by that I
Yep.
mean, you look at a show like Cops, Cops, and then you have now on cable virtually every major profession, you have some kind of reality show that isn't
Right.
really reality. You had, your typical shows like your Judge Judy or not Night Court, what was it? The People's Court.
Yeah.
Um, but then you also had these faux news broadcasts, Entertainment Tonight for Hollywood and its celebrities, Inside Edition, and what was the one that was most infamous? I think it was Maury Povich that started it
A
with
current
a
affair.
current affair.
Yeah.
That was like the absolute rock bottom, and yet now that would be somehow deemed respectable in today's internet age,
Yeah.
as a
Well,
source.
one of the two of the shows that premiered in the 80s, I think, are important because they are in two ends of or two sides of the same coin, I suppose. One of them was Regis and Kathy Lee. The other was the Sally Jesse Raphael
Yeah,
show.
yeah.
And I think Sally Jesse, although she had credibility from having hosted a radio talk show, nationally syndicated, that starts to introduce the Jenny Jones and the Maury Povich show and the Jerry Springer and these talk show formats that really become something much worse than that. On the other hand, you've got Regis and Kathy Lee, and you have Oprah Winfrey. And those, in some sense, take their cue from the Phil Donahue type of show.
Yeah.
I don't want to give these shows credit for being better than they are. And I think that Oprah, particularly, has introduced some very disturbing and damaging elements into our culture that we could do without. But they aren't the same kind of sensationalist shows that Springer is. And so you see the birth of that kind of programming as well that changes what daytime TV particularly looks like.
Well, you mentioned Oprah Winfrey and her show, and I'm probably a little more down on her than you are in the sense that I think that if you wanted to say that Phil Donahue was the gold standard of morning talk or non-network or non-primetime talk shows, I think Oprah is probably a good 30 points below on a 1 to 100 scale, and then another 30 points below you've got the Sallys and the
Yeah,
Geraldos and
yeah.
and
If
Maury's.
I gave the impression that I had good things to say about Oprah, I don't. I want to correct that.
Yeah,
I think she had a veneer of credibility
yeah,
that these other shows. You wouldn't say Oprah was in the gutter like Jerry was, but I think Oprah introduced an entirely bad element into television and through television into society in the same way that toxic waste poured into the river tends to pollute the entire environment. Now, am I comparing Oprah to toxic waste? Not necessarily, but the emotion, the emoting, the sharing the feelings, all these different kinds of things, we've become so touchy-feely in the years since that show premiered, and I give a lot of the blame for that to her. So I don't want to sound like I'm a fan of Oprah's because I'm not, but I will acknowledge that there was a credibility she had that some of these other shows didn't.
Well, I think too a disturbing thing that her show did different than say Donahue. Donahue would have a scientist on, or a philosopher, and
Hmm.
Ayn Rand, which I can't stand her, but he did a show that had depth. With Oprah
Yes.
Winfrey, you get, instead of Ayn Rand as whatever you can say bad about her,
Hmm.
you get Dr. Phil or Dr.
Yeah.
Oz, and to me, these are quacks. I mean, Dr. Oz isn't even a medical doctor. Not Dr. Oz. Dr. Phil isn't even
Dr.
a
Phil.
medical
Yeah.
doctor or a shrink any longer. And they it's sort of like if you were trying to do Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom and have Marlon Perkins all of a sudden one season go looking for Bigfoot and the Loch Ness monster, and it's like, come
Yes.
on, it's just that to me that's what it is. But anyway,
I agree completely.
so I do want to add one a little bit later get into back to the networks and whatnot. But I do want to start this segment really talking about the re-rise of a fourth network. It was a 30-year absence. I think 57 was when the Dumont network went off,
Yep.
and was 87 that Fox came on. And I believe the very first show, I could be wrong, was a mild, mediocre little sitcom named Duet. And so talk to me how that came about. Was that also a direct product of the 84 Cable TV Act?
Well, one of the interesting things about the Fox network, in talking about fourth networks, there was one that you overlooked, and there's a good reason you overlooked it, because it was only around for about 3 weeks. That was called the Overmeyer Network, and it had other names as well. It only produced one show, which was the Las Vegas show. If anybody has heard of it at all, they would recognize it as the Bill Dana show. And not Bill Dana's sitcom, but it was a talk show that ran for a couple of hours a night, a late night talk show that was designed to be picked up by affiliates other than NBC. CBS and ABC didn't have late night shows, so it was designed to pick them up. The network bottomed out after about 3 weeks. The Dana show was the only show they ever put on, and so that's disaster number one. Number two, you have something that I just mentioned actually a few minutes ago called Operation Prime Time, which was never intended to be a full-service network, but it was intended to provide programming for independents and disgruntled affiliates that they could use to put in their prime time schedule. And that went on for some time. But again, that was never intended to be a full service network.
I think, if I recall, wasn't that their idea was sort of buffet TV, that you could sort of like pick and choose what you wanted to broadcast?
Exactly. And so you had things like, I think PM Magazine may have been part of that, as well
I
as
remember that.
Entertainment Tonight. And you had some actually very good, or at least very entertaining miniseries that they showed with some credible stars. You had Glenn Ford starring in one of them, Evening in Byzantium, but it was never going to be a fourth network. Fox started, and here we'll get into the splitting hairs aspect of it, I suppose. The first program Fox actually had was the Joan Rivers show, but that wasn't a prime time program. That was a late night program, and that was what gave Fox its first measure of credibility, that it was able to attract someone of the caliber of Joan Rivers to sign on with them.
As well as the wrath of Johnny Carson.
Absolutely, which is another story there, a sad story. But Joan Rivers served two functions. First, the Joan Rivers show became the first show that Fox actually had on the air, but not the first primetime show. The second thing that Joan Rivers did was make it possible for Arsenio Hall to come on, because he became the replacement when Joan got the sack from Fox. And Arsenio goes on to create, he does pretty well in that time slot until the whole prime time, the whole late night aspect of Fox is canceled. He was just kind of a caretaker until the contract ran out, but he goes on to have his own talk show in syndication and later in other areas filling in. And so Arsenio becomes a big star because of that. But the Fox, and I don't know how much Fox may have had to do with that cable act, but what Fox did have was money, and it had the ability to be able to leverage its prestige and its financial power to be able to not only create a network, but to be able to produce the shows that were going to be on the network rather than relying on independent producers. Again, one of the governmental acts that came into play with something like this was when the syndication laws were loosened, the regulations were loosened somewhat to allow networks to be able to produce and syndicate their own programming in a way that they weren't able to previously. So Fox is able to fill this void, or actually what I should say is they're able to fill the spots in the schedule by doing their own shows. And you had Duet, which was one of the very first shows they did. You had the Tracy Ullman Show, which became one of its early successes and introduced the signature of Fox, which is The Simpsons. They started out as a interstitial cartoon on the Tracy Ullman Show and were eventually spun off into their own show, which is still going. And they had some other interesting ideas for programming. They had a sitcom called Mr. President with George C. Scott. And again, I suspect only Fox would have had the finances and the gravitas to be able to get an actor of Scott's quality into what turned out to be a pretty bad sitcom.
And there was 21 Jump Street, and there was also Married with Children, which other than The Simpsons is probably the keynote. Well, it's the keynote live show, live human show.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Fox starts to build from that slow start to have some very successful, or at least very good, interesting niche programming. What catapults Fox over the top, because the success of any fourth network is going to rely on its ability to build affiliates. And at the outset, Fox only tries to do a small amount of programming. They start out with a night a week and only two hours worth of programming that night. And they slowly begin to expand to add more nights to the schedule until they are programming 7 nights a week. They never go really beyond 2 hours of programming in prime time, and they never attempt to do daytime or morning programming. That's important because it's what I would consider a very controlled rollout of a network, whereas other attempts tried to mimic the ABC, NBC, CBS format. Fox goes in a bit different direction, but Fox does something that the other wannabes had tried and failed to do. Fox gets the NFL. They're able to take away the National Football Conference contract away from CBS, where it had been for 30 or 40 years. Yeah. And that instantly gives it affiliate credibility. All of a sudden, you see local stations leaving their CBS affiliation and going to Fox because they can keep their football. You see stations that had previously been independent going to Fox because they can give people the NFL. And without the NFL, I doubt that you're going to see Fox being able to build an affiliate lineup that is going to be able to allow them to continue and become a legitimate fourth network. Now, I think that what Fox did, not in focusing on prime time and on football, what Fox did was create the template of what the network seemed to be moving to now. You've seen that NBC, for example, has lengthened the Today Show to the point where that's the only programming they have as a network in the mornings, and they've given up the entire afternoon schedule over to repeats, or I should say continuous NBC News. And I don't know if they just repeat the same show over and over, or if they're like headline news where they just keep going. But the point is, that
ABC does the same thing with Good Morning America, except they have the 1 hour break with The View, which is produced by ABC.
Yeah, only CBS has maintained any kind of original daytime programming in the sense that they have The Price is Right and Let's Make a Deal. But otherwise, the networks have abandoned the daytime model that they relied on for so long and have come to more or less mimic what Fox started out with. And so again, you see that role of Fox in the 80s as being, perhaps inadvertently, but being a trailblazer for what network programming in the daytime is like today.
Well, I do want to, before we talk about some of the shows and the landmark events of the 1980s, I do want to talk about something that I think is very important, but isn't so much television itself generated as something that came from television. And let me explain it this way. We are recording this a week to the day after Donald Trump was reelected as the 47th president of the United States. And anyone watching this decades from now would know that the initials MAGA, MAGA, stand for Make America Great. And the MAGA movement is sort of a redo of 10 or 15 years ago when they had the Tea Party movement. But it seems to me that all of this goes back to the 1980s television and televangelism. And I don't think you can talk about the 1980s in American television without talking about televangelism. Now, certainly there were religious programs on radio in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Certainly there were, most television stations would have on a Sunday, which they might only broadcast for 8 hours, you would have the first thing on would be the daily prayer. Then there might be, a round robin of ministers every day from, the top 10 or 12 churches of wherever, doing the prayer for the day, doing a little 20-minute thing, and then the regular program. Sundays, you would have things like when I was growing up, I saw Davy and Goliath. You'd see those little programs. You would have some local, maybe the largest church, have a broadcast mass. Getting back to the televangelism, then it seems to be that in the late 70s, but basically I think it's the early 80s, you get the Moral Majority, you get Jimmy Swaggart. You certainly always had Billy Graham and his Crusades, sometimes being broadcast, syndicated throughout the 60s and 70s. But you then get a whole host, Jim and Tammy Baker. I mean, they become, for a 3-4 year period in the mid-'80s, they become almost superstars of television.
Yeah.
Until the inevitable scandals happen. Jim and Tammy Baker, a sex scandal. Falwell, some financial scandals. Jimmy Swaggart, a sex scandal. And it seems to me that this really kicked off sort of the right-wing movement that would eventually become the MAGA movement through this, whether it was being anti-abortion, whether it was anti-homosexuality, these kinds of things. So what can you explain just a little bit culturally the import or lack of import that televangelism had in the American culture, and how did TV either broadcast or make worse some of this?
Well, I think to just sidetrack for a moment on the background of this, and I don't want to go too deeply into it, but you're right. Network television had, for the most part, abandoned any kind of religious programming by the 70s and 80s. Billy Graham was syndicated, but you didn't have any show that would have been comparable to Bishop Sheen's Life is Worth Living. Yeah. And the other types of religious programming that you had that had any kind of national impact would have probably been more shows like Insight or The Christophers or This Is the Life, where you're having dramatized stories that are imparting a culturally religious or moral significance, moral to the story. And so those were the kinds of programs that religion had basically gotten to by the time we get to shows like the 700 Club, the PTL Club, things of this nature. I think the reason I brought that up in the way I did is because I think this was another case where you had an audience that partly was reacting out of frustration at the lack of the kind of programming that they desired. So you didn't have network programming that was appealing to them directly on a faith-based basis. And so that made them hungry for a certain kind of programming. You also have a growth in television startup stations on a local basis at the higher end of the dial, from 18 to channel 18, the ones where you'd need the bow tie type of antenna or a loop antenna to be able to get them, low frequency stations that need programming. And often these stations would be created in particular markets to function specifically as an outlet for religious programming. When I look at TV guides from the Bay Area, for instance, in the late 70s, you see them running continuous loops of the 700 Club. It might be on, or the PTL Club. It might be on for two or three airings a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. So you're looking at 4-6 hours perhaps of this kind of programming. So it's filling a void culturally, and it's also filling a void in terms of programming itself that some of these stations need. They need the sponsorship, they need the revenue, they need the programming. And some of them are, as I said, specifically dedicated to religious programming. Some of them are more broadly family programming, in that they might have family-friendly movies or shows that don't have a specific religious bent, but the foundation of them is based on the televangelists, and so they become the dominant form of programming. Now, I think televangelism, like religion in general nowadays, seems to be more geared toward the conservative cultural population than the liberal or moderate population. And so if you have any kind of programming that is going to have a specifically religious foundation, it is going to have an appeal to more conservative cultural, the more culturally conservative base or demographic. And there were networks like Mother Angelica's EWTN that did not fall into this trap so much of being seen as televangelists. They provided a more foundational type of programming that was specifically oriented to the communication of theological or faith-based programs. But you also had networks like Trinity Broadcasting, which became the cable outlet for shows like Jim Baker or Jimmy Swaggart or even John Ankerberg, who was kind of a Phil Donahue of the evangelical set. And certainly it was easy for those to be co-opted by a political movement. Falwell probably was the preeminent spokesperson for combining religion and politics. Falwell created the Moral Majority. Falwell himself was a pretty savvy political guy. He created Liberty University, which now has a big-time college football program. So who would have figured that Falwell's university would have wound up playing in the Fiesta Bowl? It's another one of life's ironies. But I think it was inevitable that there would be a confluence between culturally conservative religious programming and politically conservative messages, and it's a comfortable partnership between the two of them in some ways. But you remember that, again, we're talking on a cultural basis. The programming itself was often cringeworthy, but the cultural aspect of it, you remember that when Thomas Jefferson talked about the separation of church and state, what he was really referring to was the protection of religion from interference by the government, and not the fear of government of religion getting into the public square. He was more concerned about creating a state-based religion. And anytime you have politicians beginning to use religion for their own political advantage, if you are a religious person, if you're a religious network, you're playing with fire. You are allowing politics to co-opt your message rather than trying to make your imprint on the political message. And so it was inevitable, I think, that you would wind up having a really ugly relationship between politics and religion, in the sense that politicians began to use religious programming for their own means, not necessarily religious ones, but they were exploiting the medium. You had people like Jim and Tammy Faye themselves, and I don't want to critique them on a theological basis. Obviously, their kind of religion is not the same as my kind of religion, but I don't want to get into the question of their sincerity or anything like that. What I do want to say is that it was very easy for programs like this to be co-opted by the lure of money and the lure of power and the lure of fame that are completely separate from politics. You join it to politics, and you start to be able to create a machine. You start to have real influence on the political process, so much so that Jerry Falwell winds up being a guest on William F. Buckley's firing line, with the topic being, is the moral majority a threat to American democracy? And I use that program specifically to point out that Falwell had by that time become such a big player in the national political scene that a show like Buckley's Firing Line believes that it is important to have him on as a guest to talk about this and find out just what the role of the moral majority and religious programming in general, televangelists, what role and impact they are having on the political process.
So let us trot on back to the big three networks and talk about some of the goings on there. In terms of historically looking back with 40 years hindsight, certainly the most memorable thing that happened on network television was probably the ending of MASH. A 90-minute show. It beat out The Fugitive as the all-time highest ending. We talked about Fox Network coming on. But also then we saw the rise of NBC with basically Cheers running 11 years, the now infamous Bill Cosby and his show, Roseanne. So let's start with the MASH ending. This seems to me to have been the high mark of where the networks were. They would never, ever reach that height again in terms of audience appeal. Any comments about that last show or its impact or import 40 years on?
I think the impact of the episode is not so much in whether or not it was a good episode of MASH or whether or not it was a good closing episode for a series, but what it really did, I think, was codify the idea that a successful long-running series deserves to have a final episode.
Yeah.
Previously, that had been done very seldom. You had Route 66, you had a de facto final episode on Leave It to Beaver, you had The Fugitive, but you didn't usually have something like that. Now, with MASH, you've really made it not only a rule, that you're going to have a final episode, but you've also made it a rule that it's going to be an episode that's going to be big. It's going to be 2-3 times the normal length of the episode. You're going to dominate the entire evening. You're going to lead up to it. It's going to become a cultural event. And you see that continue with other shows that you've had in the 80s that go on into the 90s. You see the final episode of Saint Elsewhere, which is one of the best final episodes in that it winds up turning out that the entire thing was an illusion. You have the final episode of Dynasty, which builds off of the cliffhanger endings to create doubt about what's going to happen. You have other shows that capitalize on this with their own final endings. Cheers.
Newhart.
Newhart, I think, is the definitive final episode of a show, the greatest one that I've ever seen. But I think what MASH served to do was make that part of what a successful show was entitled to, that it was entitled to have a final episode. And you'd see it in shows like Friends and Cheers and L.A. Law and everything else, that they were entitled to go out that way. That was a trend before MASH. After MASH, I think it became a rule.
Yeah. So NBC started the decade in the basement, ratings-wise, with such fare as Super Train, most infamously. And then it sort of, Cheers came along a couple of years later, Family Ties, but then the ground was set, and then Bill Cosby comes along, and it was his, other than discounting Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, it was his third or fourth show on from his 20 years earlier I Spy rise to fame. And it becomes the biggest cultural phenomenon since All in the Family a decade or so earlier. And it dominates for 4 or 5 years as Archie Bunker and All in the Family did, until it gives way to, Roseanne and Tim Allen's shows. So what made the Cosby Show, and putting aside all the revelations we know about Bill Cosby now, what made the Cosby Show so big? Because when I looked at it even then, to me they were just what was the Michael J. Fox show, Family Ties. They were just a black version of that. There didn't seem to be anything new. It wasn't edgy the way All in the Family was. It wasn't political the way MASH was. It was. I mean, there didn't seem to be anything that was breaking ground. But then it just blew up.
Right. Well, it was number one in the ratings for 3 consecutive years there, 86, 87, and 88. And what people forget, I think a lot of people forget, or maybe didn't even know, that the sitcom prior to Cosby was almost on life support. Well, it was on life support. You didn't have any sitcoms to speak of on television. Even as Cosby comes on, you have very few. And so, as TV Guide puts it in one of their cover stories, is the TV sitcom dead? Not just on life support at that point, but dead. And so Cosby reinvigorates the sitcom. His appeal escapes me. I'm not a big sitcom fan in general, although there are some that I like a lot. But what Cosby did was get away from all of the things that you mentioned. It's not political. People wanted that. It is not edgy. People wanted that. It presents a black, middle-class, successful family, upper middle class, that is very comforting to people in the midst of all kinds of racial turmoil. The idea that you have a very successful black family is a justification of the Reagan era. You have Cosby himself, who is a friendly, comforting presence. He's wearing these sweaters that become kind of a cultural touchstone in terms of fashion. The people in the show are likable. The kids are likable. The stories are humorous. My friend and fellow blogger David Hofstede has a term for this kind of a show. He calls it comfort TV. It becomes like macaroni and cheese. It is comforting to have on. It's comforting to watch. And so what Cosby does is revitalize the sitcom. You would be hard pressed to draw a straight line from Cosby to a show like Friends, because they're very different shows. But I would argue that Cosby's success makes all of these other sitcoms possible, because without Cosby, maybe you don't have sitcoms again the way you once did. And the man, when you're talking about NBC's revitalization in general, the man we need to credit for that is Brandon Tartikoff, because Fred Silverman had tried to, in moving from ABC to NBC, Silverman had tried to replicate the success he had on ABC, and what it produced were shows like Supertrain. When Tartikoff takes over, he reinvigorates NBC. He has a base of a handful of shows that have been successful, like Little House on the Prairie. But Tartikoff gets into some of these other areas. You talk about what a disaster NBC was in. At that point in time, you've got Little House on the Prairie being one of only 3 successful shows they have. I think the other 2 are Different Strokes, which is the only other successful sitcom they have, and Real People, which
I think Facts of Life
that was coming in there. But in the top 20, you had only those 3 shows. You had Saturday Night Live, which really was on a life support at that point, and you had The Tonight Show, which Carson was supposedly in negotiations to take completely over to ABC. So NBC was in a bad way when Tartikoff comes in, but he's working hand in hand with Grant Tinker as a head of the network and as the producer of a lot of successful shows. And so that partnership is what really reinvigorates NBC and brings it around to become the must-see TV of the latter part of that decade.
Also widespread was the return of the late night soap, or the primetime soap.
Yep.
It had been 15 or more years since Peyton Place had gone off the air. Dallas comes in 78, and by 1980 you have the Who Shot JR episode, and then Dynasty comes in and sort of out Dallas's Dallas.
And then you have Knots Landing, which is interesting because that's a spin-off of Dallas, a direct spin-off of Dallas. But Knots Landing actually winds up having a longer run on network TV and a more successful run than Dallas. It doesn't achieve the highs. It doesn't have the Who Shot JR moment. But Knots Landing is a steady, consistent show that carries the night for CBS. You also have these other spin-offs from, you have a spin-off from Dynasty. I can't remember the name of it, but Charlton Heston's
the Colbys.
Yes. And so you've introduced that new genre, that new old genre, the nighttime soap opera, which takes off and dominates that aspect of television. Some of them are more successful than others, but there's no question that it's successful.
Well, why do you think primetime soaps became big again? Because between Peyton Place and the shows we just mentioned, I think the only primetime soap I can mention, well, it wasn't primetime really, would have been Mary Hartman, but that was a satire.
Yeah, as was Soap. Soap itself was a satire. Yeah. And then you had failed efforts like Beacon Hill, which were really more like a Masterpiece Theater than anything else. I will give a crack as to what I think the success of the soaps, what it entailed. And we're not talking about Dallas specifically, because Dallas, as you pointed out, started in the late 70s, but the decade of the 80s is marked by many people as a decade of greed and avarice, wealth, success. The economy is booming after the early struggles of the Reagan administration, where the economy's in bad shape. It starts to boom. You have movies like Wall Street. You have success being defined as excess. And you don't get any more excess than what you see on shows like Dynasty and Dallas. They provide you with the key elements that people always enjoy watching. They enjoy watching rich people who have what they don't have. They can live vicariously through them. They enjoy rich people having terrible things happen to them, because we all know that one of the foundational aspects of watching television is to see people in worse shape than you are. They have these incredibly glamorous people, whether you're talking about Joan Collins or Donna Mills or Victoria Principal or any of these. Some of them are heroines, some of them are bitches, but you have these incredibly over-the-top, larger-than-life personalities that dominate these shows that are dealing with incredible wealth and excess, where bad things can happen to bad people, but bad things can also happen to good people. And just like the afternoon soap operas, but on a much, much, much bigger scale, you have these things that are just huge. Well, I don't want to repeat myself, but when I say larger than life, that is an epic quality that had been missing from television for a long time, and people were ready for it.
So let's talk about the news, network news and television news in the 80s. We've done shows on the news overall throughout the history of television in America. But specifically to the 80s, it seemed that throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the news at the networks was constantly in flux. Sometimes you'd have multiple anchors on a show, sometimes you wouldn't. By 81, 82, it's just personality on personality on personality, and the big three are Dan Rather at CBS, Tom Brokaw at NBC, and Peter Jennings at ABC. They all have their moments in the sun. I think early on in the 80s, Rather dominated. Then I think Jennings took over for 6 or 7 years. And then by the time we get to the 21st century, Brokaw, before he retired, is dominating. You have 60 Minutes, 2020. And then you get the constant knockoffs. You get the re-rise of Monitor after 25 or 30 years of being gone. And then you end up with a show too, Dateline, which now I think has devolved into what you had mentioned, a current affair. It's that level. But it started out seriously in the 80s as a show. So what is the zeitgeist of that era for network television news?
The decade begins in a transitional phase, because in the early 80s you have Walter Cronkite retiring at NBC or at CBS, and it transitions over to Dan Rather. You have John Chancellor retiring at NBC, and it's transitioning eventually to Tom Brokaw. For a little while they try a co-anchors with Brokaw and Roger Mudd, but then Mudd heads back to CBS and Brokaw becomes the lone anchor.
But what didn't they also try? What was her name? The Chinese American woman. What was her name?
Connie Chung. You mean on
yeah,
CBS?
Yeah. Okay. That was CBS.
That was and that was later on too. That was when Rather started to lose his mojo, and they tried to invigorate it. ABC, you actually have coming from a position of strength when Roone Arledge takes over the news department, and you get World News Tonight with a 3-anchor system. But that is in transition by the early 80s as well. You have the death of Frank Reynolds, who has become the face of ABC News, and he's replaced by Peter Jennings, and World News itself morphs from being a 3-anchor to a 1-anchor show. So you have, by the end of the 80s, you have those big three. You have Rather, Brokaw, and Jennings. You also have a transition a potential transition, although they don't know it yet, where CNN has introduced the concept of 24/7 news. And they don't know yet that this is going to entirely change the face of network news to the point where stories that would ordinarily have been covered on the networks are now almost completely given over to the cable networks. You have all of them having their own versions of cable news. Probably, as you suggested, the pivotal moments in news history in the 80s are the assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan, first of all. And I'm reminded of that because I heard someone talking about the assassination attempt against Donald Trump a while back. And for someone of his age, the person who is speaking, who is, in their 40s, but for him, it was the first time he had ever seen anything like this unfolding on network news. For people of, sadly, an older age, it is seeing the assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan, which becomes a major story on television and its coverage of it. After that, you have, I think, two pivotal events that happen. One of them is news, definitely news related. It's the fall of the Berlin Wall, which, for someone of my age, was inconceivable, unthinkable that the Berlin Wall would ever fall. But you have the news coverage of Ronald Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And it seems an idle threat. And here a few years later, it becomes an astonishing news event. You have the attempted assassination of John Paul II and the successful assassination of Anwar Sadat. So you have this crisis news coverage that is going on, and it is being augmented by networks like CNN, where they are providing the background and the depth to the story that the networks may not have. You have that culminating eventually in the first Gulf War, where CNN is as big a player in this as the three news networks. But then you have another major event that I just want to throw in here because I don't think it fits anyplace else. And it's not really a news event, but it kind of is at the same time. It's Live Aid. And Live Aid establishes MTV as being a legitimate network for something other than just news videos. Live Aid is a day-long concert that happens in London and in Philadelphia. It's to raise money for African hunger relief. It runs for 13 hours, I think. It is shown in syndication in a certain parts of the country, because you'll remember what we talked about before. MTV isn't seen in all the major markets. So there is a syndicated network that puts together coverage of most of Live Aid. And then the final 3 hours shifts over to ABC, where Dick Clark hosts it. But other than that, the only place where you can see Live Aid in its entirety is on MTV. And it makes stars out of the MTV VJs who were becoming stars, but now they are bona fide stars because they are covering something that is almost akin to a news event. It's talking about a very serious issue, which is the situation in Africa. It's providing live coverage as it happens, which is previously something you would only have seen in news coverage, and it gives the network a credibility that it didn't have previously. When I look at the top 10 let's say the top 25 events in the history of television, and you're talking about various assassinations and moon landings and other cultural touchstones, I include Live Aid in that list because I think it is a cultural touchstone as well as a television touchstone. In the future, if anything like that is going to happen, it's going to be on TV. You would never have Woodstock not be the Woodstock of the future would have to be on TV. Yeah. And I think that comes from Live Aid.
Well, I would add one other thing there, news-wise, that I think was very important, and that's the Challenger disaster.
Yes, yeah, I forgot completely about that. You're absolutely right. That's an incredible moment in history.
Well, and I think the thing too is politically, what happens is we find out that the Challenger disaster, and I don't think I'm screwing it up with the later Columbia disaster, but with Challenger, wasn't it that we found out that they wanted to delay the launching because of the coldness of the weather and the O-rings, and
Yes.
they launched it actually because Reagan wanted to have his chat with the teacher that went up there and have the president and the teacher have a live phone call on network television, and it seems that when that happened, that seemed to at least begin the beginning of the burst of the Reagan bubble, because he had been on an incredible roll. He'd won a landslide in '84.
Mm-hmm.
Everything seemed rosy. Morning in America again, all that stuff. Then it seems the nation that could send a man to the moon only a decade and a half later, or almost a little over 17 years
Yeah.
later, couldn't even get a shuttle off the ground. Iran-Contra comes along. You then have Black Friday in '87, and it began sort of a losing streak that ended with Reagan's retirement. And it also seemed to be one of those things that was what, say, JFK's assassination was a quarter century earlier.
That's a perceptive insight into this. I think what actually the tie-in with Reagan was that the State of the Union address was scheduled for that night,
Okay.
and there had been talk that what Reagan had wanted to be able to do. You're right that he did want to talk to the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, but he had also wanted to be able to include a line in the State of the Union speech that, in essence, was saying that the success of the American space program and the American endeavor, that tonight, as we speak, a shuttle is orbiting around this planet that carries a teacher in it. Now, I think there may have been pressure from the White House. I don't think Reagan himself was involved in it, but there was, I think, perhaps some pressure from the White House involved in that. What hurt Reagan as well in that, though, was what came out about the lack of competence and management that was going on at NASA. NASA had been one of the few institutions that had come through all of the post-Watergate cynicism about government in general. NASA was one of the few institutions that had emerged from that in a relatively pristine light. Yes, there had been the Apollo fire in 1967, and that showed some unsavory things about NASA, but we have short memories. And then that was followed by the incredibly spectacular Apollo 11 success. There was the Apollo 13 rescue in space, essentially, that showed how much ingenuity there was at NASA. NASA, as a reflection of government competence, as a reflection of the Reagan administration, NASA was something that you could be proud of. And all of a sudden, with the Challenger explosion and with the subsequent investigation that showed a lot of the sloppiness, a lot of the cutting of corners, a lot of the things that were going on, the lack of managerial oversight at NASA, and the feeling of arrogance, the feeling of just taking things for granted, was a really bad look for everybody involved. It's something that NASA never recovered from because it was just regurgitated with the Columbia disaster. You found many of the same things that NASA said they had cleared up were right there again, and you had the Hubble telescope that didn't work correctly, and all of these other things. I'm getting off into another area because I'm a real buff, space buff, but I could talk about that for hours. But in what we're talking about, the explosion of the shuttle on television, live again, I want to point out, it was live on CNN. It was a replay on all the others, but CNN covered it as it happened. The subsequent investigation into it, I think it was the Rogers Committee that investigated, and that a lot of that was on television. It was certainly on CNN, and so a lot of these problems were exposed to the entire American public on television, and I think you're perceptive to include that in the general derogation that you see in the Reagan administration in its last years, which is not uncommon in the second term of any president. But when you combine that with the stock market crisis, the Iran-Contra affair, all these other things, it just kind of adds to it. And it adds to it in a most dramatic and horrifying manner.
So let's get some of your final thoughts, though, about the 1980s, pro or con. You had said earlier, as far as television news, I mean, and every decade is going to be transitional from the one before to the one after. But it seems to me that if we're looking back on this now with 40 years of hindsight, of the decades that we've done so far, up to the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it seems to me that this, despite what we said about cable news or whatnot, it seemed that television in the 80s was more about the business and less about the medium or the art.
I absolutely. I think there's one thing I want to really quickly mention, which were the miniseries, because there were some fantastic ones in the 80s. You had the Thornbirds, North and South, The Winds of War, War and Remembrance, Shogun, Smiley's People, Brideshead Revisited, Lace, some better than others.
Cain and Abel was actually a pretty good one.
Yes, it was. And so they became a dominant form of television. And linking that to what you had just said, I think it shows that there was a certain stagnation in creativity in television that made those miniseries so big. And you had some significant shows in other areas too. You had Cagney and Lacey, two female cops on TV. You had Kate and Allie, two females bringing up their families in the sitcom era. You had again Star Trek, which was coming back. You had Max Headroom, which was kind of showing the punk aspects of TV coming to the fore. But when I was doing a refresher course on television in the 80s to get ready for this, and I was surfing the net, one of the things that struck me is that there is a wealth of incredibly bad writing about 80s television. It's lazy, it's indolent, it doesn't go dig beneath the surface. A lot of it is factually suspect, if not outright wrong. There's a lot of bad stuff about the 80s, so you really have to dig to find the good stuff. But one of the things that comes from it is what you pointed out, that a lot of this bad stuff about the 80s is out there because there wasn't a lot to write about in the 80s. A lot of the shows that we revere from the 80s actually weren't that good. And the shows that really were, a show maybe like Wise Guy, which really introduces the concept of story arcs into television, you kind of overlook those. Dynasty in Dallas, you're overwhelmed by the wealth and the glitz of it, and you forget that there was some very good story writing in those shows. But I think that those are few and far between. And the fact that you can reduce an entire decade of television into, I'm looking at some of my notes here, maybe 30 shows out of an entire decade that you can really say are notable, is an unfortunate commentary on the decade. And for people who revere the 80s and who think it was a great decade, I don't I don't want to sound like a killjoy because certain aspects of it have to do with taste as well. But I don't consider the 80s to be an outstanding time for series drama. I think that the miniseries are many of them exceptional, but that just points out the shortcomings of it. And I think that the lasting impression that we have come away from in this show is that a lot of it is about the business of television and about setting up what is to come. So if you look at the dominance of sports today, it comes from the 80s. If you look at the early signs of reality television dominating, it comes from the 80s. If you look at cable TV and how it changes and how streamers come along and all of that, it comes from the 80s. So perhaps what we can say about the 80s is that what we most remember from it is what happens afterward.
Yeah, I was thinking in my mind as you were saying that that if in the Old West, what was the guys who rode the Pony Express?
Yes.
That if the '40s started out in St. Louis and where we are now is in Los Angeles, the 1980s were sort of lost in a past somewhere in Utah.
You're right, and that again is not to overlook the shows that are good. If you love Cheers, if you love Night Court, if you love The Simpsons, if you love these shows, you're going to look at the '80s as a really good time. But as you and I both know from that show we did on the golden age of television, a handful, even a dozen, 2 dozen shows out of an entire 10 years of television does not make a golden age. And so I think this has some highs and some lows, but if you're looking for lasting impact, it's going to be what it sets up.
Well, we'll let it go at that, and we'll be back next month with another show. We'll pick the topic, but it won't be the 90s. We'll probably wait till next year to tackle the 1990s. But again, Mitch, always good to speak with you on this.
You as well, Dan. I enjoyed. Check me out online. Pass along any comments you might have on things you'd like us to talk about. I'm looking forward to the next time.
Okay.